All right. Hello. Welcome to a unique edition of the Kingdom Says podcast. You'll notice that I am not joined by my usual guests, Garrett and Kyle. Although I suppose I'm the usual co-host, or I'm not the co-host. I'm one of the co-hosts. So I'm not used to doing the introductions either. So this is a unique episode because we're talking about the draft, which is why those two are not here tonight. Just to pull back the curtain, I'm actually recording this about an hour after the Chiefs have secured their bid to go to the Super Bowl. They just beat the Bengals in the AFC Championship game. But there's still some draft business that needs to be covered, and that is the Senior Bowl, which with practices starting in the game coming shortly after that, I wanted to talk about some prospects that are specifically names that the Chiefs are going to have their eyes on down in Mobile. So this is not everybody that's going to be in the 2023 draft class. If you're not familiar, the Reese's Senior Bowl is obviously, as it says, for seniors. There's a couple of exceptions with some undergraduate athletes who have already earned their degrees. Sometimes those guys get invites, but for the most part, these are players who have played through their 4 years of college, got their degrees, and are looking to be pro prospects. So a lot of these names are maybe not all going to be first-round guys. There's a couple guys that I think could very well sneak in, but a lot of these are going to be day 2, day 3 picks. But I think that if you have watched the Chiefs for very long, especially if you have watched even just the playoffs this year where our 7th-round rookie is grabbing interceptions. If I remember correctly, Jalen Watson played in the Senior Bowl, and I know that Joshua Williams did as well. So definitely a place that Kansas City keeps their eyes. You know, every NFL team is down there, and they're combing through these rosters to find players who are going to contribute to their roster. So it's important to just kind of know who to look for and what to look for. Again, there's some players down there who I think are really good players, and they might end up on the Chiefs roster. They might end up on the Chiefs radar. I had to narrow this list down to 10. I will tell you that the offensive and defensive line group down there are going to be pretty strong, and I'm pretty excited to get to see some of these guys, especially some of these smaller school prospects, play against some of these, tougher competitions. That's one of the other benefits of the Senior Bowl is you get some kids who played in different, conferences, played in smaller schools, didn't get the same exposure as, these guys who played in the SEC or who played, in a Power 5 premier program. And so you get those guys every year who stand out and who come up the draft boards, and you really get to see how talented they are. So without any other, further hubbub or to introduce the topic, we're going to just jump right in, and we're going to start with my number 10 player, and it's probably a position that's going to surprise people a little bit. It's Chase Brown, who's a running back out of Illinois, who quietly had just a phenomenal rushing season for Illinois. Really put up some crazy good numbers. I think if he wasn't leading the NCAA and rushing yards, he was near the top. He's an interesting player because he's not a huge guy, but he's thickly built, and he probably is going to be a rotational player more than anything else. But I know the Chiefs, they may be looking to move on from Clyde Edwards-Helaire. They like to have competition in the running back room. And Chase Brown is a guy who probably isn't going to test as an elite athlete. He's going to be a guy who's going to just kind of be okay at everything. And that's what you want sometimes with these runners. He doesn't have a lot of, despite his, his senior season being very productive, he doesn't have a lot of wear and tear on him. I think he was a 2-year starter. I think that he has the ability to be a good rotational back. I think he's got room to improve in the receiving game. And also he's one of those guys, and this you'll hear me reference this a lot if you haven't looked it up already. It's Bruce Feldman's All Freak list. Bruce Feldman's a writer for The Athletic. He does a lot of college football stuff, but he puts out an annual list, and he covers the college football games like most freaky athletes. And Chase Brown made his list this year. He's going to come in around 6 foot, 205, 207, somewhere in there. And I just think that he's a solid all around back who can do a little bit of everything. Reminds me, not necessarily in terms of the same running style, but reminds me just in terms of like as a prospect and as the potential, or like as the role. The Washington Commanders drafted Brian Robinson last year in the 5th round. And Chase Brown kind of reminds me of that in the sense that I think he's going to be underdrafted. He's going to end up, going up kind of getting drafted a little bit later than what he should be. And he's probably going to be a really solid contributor for some team in the NFL. So that's the only running back on my list. So if you're, in the belief that running backs don't matter and you don't want to hear about any more running backs, the good news is he was the last one and the only one on the list. We've got him out of the way. Let's go ahead and talk about a position that I know is going to be a point of conversation during the offseason, and that's offensive tackle. The first offensive tackle on my list, and yeah, that's a spoiler. There's a couple others on here. Is Wanya Morris out of Oklahoma. Morris is built like an offensive lineman. He came in as a 5-star recruit when he was in high school, and he ended up playing at Tennessee and then transferred over to Oklahoma. He's one of those guys who, and I know Trey Smith's situation was a little bit different. In fact, if I remember right, Morris, I think, was part of the same recruiting class or maybe was part of the same grouping as Trey Smith. He always had this potential, but never put it all together. And that's, those are things that you look for. Again, this is a guy who I think right now is probably a day 3 player. He really does have all the physical gifts to play tackle in the NFL. Now, is he going to be able to get his hands right, to get his footwork right? I think sometimes he just looks clunky when he's moving. Most of all, I just think that he gets his hands out of position so often and doesn't really lock guys down, and he gets moved around by guys who are smaller who get up under his shoulder pads. And so there's a lot of technical issues, with his game that need to be improved. But one of the things to watch for the Senior Bowl is how do these guys respond to, NFL level coaching. And Morris is a guy who I think could probably move himself from a late day 3 pick to a high day 3, or maybe even if he has an incredible week, start to get some day 2 conversation, 3rd round pick or something, a 2nd or 3rd round pick. Again, he really underachieved in college for everything that he was supposed to be, but that doesn't mean that he can't be a solid tackle in the NFL. And I think that he probably projects more to the right side. He does struggle he struggles a lot more in pass protection. He actually flashes. He's pretty nasty in the run game at times, although inconsistent. I think that he is probably a guy you're going to put on the right tackle spot. You don't want him necessarily protecting the blind side. And it might take a couple of years before he is a starter, but he's a guy that, again, you're looking for value on day 3 of the draft. Wanya Morris is definitely a guy to keep your eye on, and he could definitely improve his stock as the season goes on. The next one is a guy who I've been really high on for most of the season, and I think you talk about guys who could sneak into the first round. This is one of those guys on that list. Rashee Rice, he's a wide receiver out of SMU, 6'2", 203, somewhere in there. I think he's going to run better than what people expect. And he was probably maybe so far of the receivers I've watched. 2023 class is interesting because there's not necessarily like an alpha receiver. There's not a guy you look at and go, that's a number 1 receiver. Even Quentin Johnston, who a lot of people thought was going to be that guy, kind of had a disappointing playoff series. So Rashee Rice, to me, has the upside to be a guy who we talk about in a couple of years and go, man, how did he end up in the 2nd round and not the 1st round? How did he end up, falling as far as he did? Just because I think he has so much natural, talent and potential, and he has the knack for making some really incredible catches. Now, there are not a perfect game. He has a lot of, weird kind of concentration drops. I said I think he's going to run better than what people think, but I'm not sure in terms of how you see that on the field in terms of the game speed. I don't know if he's going to, really be a deep threat necessarily. And then there are just times where it feels like, and I don't know if this is on him or it was on his system or whatever it was, but just felt like he didn't always have the most natural feel for how to play in space, especially when a team was playing well in zone. He just seems like, he needed to understand a little bit more of how to work through those zones and how to find, those opening spots, because he just struggled sometimes against zone. But I think that he's a guy who could be a riser, especially at a Senior Bowl that doesn't have a lot of talent at the wide receiver position. I expect Rashee Rice at SMU to be the name that people are talking about. And he's one of the players on here that I would say if the Chiefs took him at the back half of the 1st round, depending on how the board falls and all that stuff, I wouldn't hate it. Based on everything I've seen from him so far, I think that he has the potential to be a really, high quality starting receiver in the NFL. The next one is a name that I'm kind of new to, that I've just picked up listening to some other people talk and decided to take a look at. And another position that you might not expect on this list, we're talking about safety Daniel Scott out of Cal. Gosh, the Cal football team is just, how do I say this? They are not a top tier football team, and there's not a lot of talent around him, but he had some flashes, and again, somebody who may take a year or two to develop. I think that he could be a rotational guy, and we know that Kansas City plays a lot of, three safeties, a lot of rotations. I think he has special teams value. I think he's more of a, closer to the line of scrimmage. I don't want to call him a box safety because that's not really a thing anymore, like a traditional strong safety. He actually has an underrated feel, I think, in zone and, playing in coverage, but he's listed at 6'2", 215, and I expect that to be relatively accurate. I don't think that he's got a lot of speed, especially when I watch him try to, if you're playing, too high and wanting him to go from the middle of the field to the sideline, I think that it's really tough to ask him to do that. I think that he's going to be a guy that you really have to bring along and ask him to do specific things, similarly to how the Chiefs might have used Daniel Sorensen in the past, not to bring up old wounds or anything like that, but I think he's definitely got more athleticism than Daniel Sorensen, but just a more of a limited player in the sense of he's still kind of, he's pretty raw. Again, his program, I don't think, did him a lot of favors just because there wasn't any really talent around him. And, he got beat deep a lot on tape and all that stuff, but, there was also not a lot of guys around him helping him out, putting him in position to be successful. So interesting name to watch. I think he's probably the biggest boomer bust guy on this list right now. I was a little conflicted about putting him on there, but I wanted to add him just because he's a name that, like I said, I'm just now getting familiar with. And I really think that some people I respect seem to think highly of him. So, wanted to add a guy who I'm not sure other people are watching. So there's a guy to watch. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying this kid's, going to be a surprise stud, but I am saying that he's somebody to watch because he could, with a solid week, really be an example of, a guy who could be a day three guy who ends up sticking around on an NFL roster for a while. All right, next on my list, the first defensive end on the list, and maybe one that I think his last year was his most disappointing, and one of the most unique talents in this draft class, kind of regardless of what you think of him overall. Andre Carter II out of Army. He's a defensive end / linebacker, might be more suited to stand up in a 3-4. This kid is listed at 6'7" and 260 pounds. In his junior year, he had 15 sacks on the years with 34 QB hurries in 2021 as a junior. And that's playing for Army. Again, not a school known for their football. Again, a guy who made Bruce Feldman's freak list. He's got a huge – he really does. He looks like a power forward. He's built like that. But his 2022 season was lackluster. He didn't do great. Had 4 sacks and almost, half of the hurries he had. Teams really picked up on him and started to, really give him more attention, and he didn't, adjust his game. So his frame is really thin. And so when we talk about putting him on as an outside linebacker or as a stand-up guy in a 3-4, that's where some of that conversation comes from. Even though he's 6'7", his frame is pretty narrow. And at times his hips, he doesn't really play as loose and as bendable, flexible as you would like to see. He's got all the athletic power, the athletic ability, plenty powerful. He's quick. He's really good at, using his 6'10" wingspan. You see some moments where he just bursts off the ball and looks like the best player on the field by a mile. But a lot of that was in 2021. And some of those numbers got kind of some lucky snaps or some lucky sacks, I would say. So I think that there is a lot of intrigue there. I think it'll be interesting to see how NFL teams use him. Obviously, with the playing at Army, there's some questions about, is he going to have to fulfill a service commitment? But from my understanding, most people think that he will be allowed to play in the NFL because he's being, drafted so high, and it's, looked as like a good PR thing for the military and for the Army Academy. Again, one of those guys who has a freaky skill set, but needs a pretty substantial amount of work. I think I'd probably take him in the 3rd round if the draft happened today, but with a solid performance in the Senior Bowl, we could see him in the 2nd round. I would hesitate to take him in the 1st round just because I don't think you have a finished product and you have somebody who, there's a lot of bust potential there just because I think he can get washed out and he has, some questions about just his frame. He is, where you're at with the point of attack and how he can hand up to, bigger athletes in the NFL. So speaking of more edge players, another guy on the list, another defensive end, probably a guy that a lot of people have heard of, but I don't know if there's been a lot of attention paid to him. And probably one of the guys that I think is more polarizing. I've seen people mock him in the in the first round. I've seen people mock him in the third or fourth round. And it's always an interesting time of year when people are trying to project players like this. But Derick Hall at Auburn, really interesting guy, fascinating story. He's been the leader of the Auburn defense for several years now. One thing that I think is important about his game is he's always played up to the competition in the SEC. By no means is he like a freak athlete, is he, anything like that, but he's 6'3", 256, somewhere in there. I think for him, it's going to be about figuring out who he is as a player for teams. It's going to be about figuring out if he has the athleticism to really hang with NFL teams, or if he's a guy who's just going to have to be a rotational player who's going to make his lunch money on being a high effort, high motor kind of guy. It'll be a pretty critical week for him, that and the combine testing, but I think this week more than anything than any other part of the offseason for Derick Hall is going to kind of decide how he is going to be seen by the NFL. And so, there's always some technical things to work on, but really he's a experienced player with long arms and uses it all well, has good technique, but again, his athleticism and how he uses all that to play is going to really decide how the NFL sees him. So Derick Hall, another guy to watch, just because I think that, if you're looking at a pass rusher on day 2, second, third round, he's a guy who might be hanging out there. And if you're looking to add to your rotation, he does make some sense for Kansas City. Next guy on my list, one of the guys that I think I like more than others, Matthew Bergeron out of Syracuse, another offensive tackle. Solid frame, 6'5", 322. I think he carries a little bit of bad weight and could tighten up a little bit. But other than that, I really like his game in terms of how he plays with balance and intention. He isn't always perfect in terms of getting off the line or isn't the most powerful guy in the room, but he has just enough power. He's just enough. He is just enough, right? That's how I would describe him. And I think if you can coach him up a little bit more, you have the chance to really get a starting tackle out of this guy. And he's probably going day 2. I think you really have to tap into his ability with his technical aspect of the game. You've got to work on some things like, again, timing off the snap. Sometimes he's just a little too slow, right, compared to the rest of the offensive line. He struggles a little bit with speed rushers. He can be, he can kind of run hot and cold, but I think that the tools are there, that if you give him patience and time and really work with him and help him maximize his ability as a technician, as an offensive line, you have a solid chance of getting a quality starting tackle, probably a right tackle. Again, I don't think he's going to be a franchise tackle by any means. I don't think that he's a guy who is going to be, a guy you want to play left tackle and watch the blind side. But I think you could plug him in probably at right tackle. He's a guy I could see being like that, the solid 10-year starter at right tackle in the NFL, just because his game is based on technique and having just enough of those physical tools to make it work. So Matthew Bergeron out of Syracuse is my number 4 player on this list. We are flying. I guess I should have told you the numbers, but we're just going through names. Number 3, we're in our top 3. Another one that is an interesting one because it's the brother of another guy on this list. Also plays for Illinois, Sidney Brown, so twin brother of Chase Brown. He plays safety for Illinois. And I tell you what, the Illinois secondary this year really has some interesting players, but I think Sidney Brown is a guy who is a little underrated in terms of what he has to offer as an athlete. And another freaks list guy from Bruce Feldman. His play on the field is pretty raw, but he definitely loves to hit people. He loves to play a physical style game. He's listed at 6 foot 205. Gosh, he's one of those guys, and the whole secondary around him is pretty talented. That unit was fun to watch, but I think he had, looks like 6 interceptions, this past year, 5 pass breakups, which is kind of all over the field. They really did have a great secondary there in Illinois. He has just, again, surprising physicality. If you're looking for a guy who I think you rotate in as that third safety, I think Sidney Brown has more upside than people think. Again, just like his brother Chase, I think both of them are really tremendous athletes and possess skills that you want on your team as an NFL team. So Sidney Brown, the safety out of Illinois, I think I'd take him. I think he's like a 4th round guy right now. Probably has a chance to sneak into that day 3, late day 2 conversation with a good week at the Senior Bowl. But I think both Sidney Brown and Chase Brown are both guys who, Illinois isn't necessarily a football powerhouse, at least isn't known for being one right now. And you get lost in the shuffle a little bit, and I think that's the case with Sidney and Chase here. But Sidney Brown, safety out of Illinois, comes in at number 3 on my list. Number 2 on my list is probably a name that some of you have heard if you follow the draft stuff at all. And again, another one, kind of like Derick Hall, a name that people know, and I see him some people say, hey, this is a first-round pick, and I see other people say this is a guy who's going to go in the 4th or 5th or later. Tennessee offensive lineman Darnell Wright, former 5-star recruit, again, had some of the same struggles we see that I've talked about with other guys, not living up to that full potential, but this last year really came to his own. Really, I would say some of his game in 2021, but he took a big step forward in 2022 as a senior, and he plays left tackle for the Tennessee Volunteers. I'm comfortable with him playing right tackle in the NFL, and I think depending on how he develops, you could maybe make that argument. I think that there's, a small chance there. He's a big dude, 6'6", 335. I would be surprised if he actually plays at that size. I think he's probably a little lighter, just, unless he's just got a really good, well-built frame, really good run blocker. I don't have a lot of complaints with him as a run blocker. I think he's a little slow off the snap sometimes. His footwork took a step forward, and he really has. He shows, like, when you talk about I said, Matthew Bergeron had just enough, right, to be a starting tackle. I think Darnell Wright has more than enough. It's just about putting it all together for him. And again, his movement skills, his ability to deal with speed rushers. I think he just, his hands can be a little heavy sometimes, it's slow getting him up into the frame of a player. And I think I saw him, you want to compare, the other offensive tackle, Matthew Bergeron, who's very balanced at times. I think Wright is a little bit more prone to, again, getting tossed around in terms of like when somebody's under his pads. I saw him on the ground a couple more times than I'd like to. But again, he's had this trajectory that is exciting in a sense. I think that NFL coaching and some time to develop could really do this kid some wonders. I would definitely give him a day 2 grade, and I think that there's some upside there. It could go either way, depending on how the Senior Bowl plays out. He could be a guy who, solidifies himself, or my concern, again, 335. He doesn't look that big on tape necessarily, but I worry about his overall athleticism and his ability to stay up to par with quicker defensive ends in the NFL. So number 2 on my list, though, is Darnell Wright, just because I think he does have more upside than some of the other tackles at the Senior Bowl this week. Last but not least, a guy who I have been huge on for a while now, and one of the freakiest athletes you're going to find in the Senior Bowl in the college football, Keion White, defensive end out of Georgia Tech. He is listed at 6'5", 286 pounds. I think somebody said, I think I read recently that he's closer to 290. He had hit I'm just going to read this. He hit a GPS time of 21 miles per hour at almost, 300 pounds. He has a vertical jump of 32 inches and has done 38 reps of 225 on the bench press, right? So all of those are well into NFL number territories. The 21 mile per hour is faster than most offensive skill players. I think back to the divisional round for the Jaguars game, Isaiah Pacheco's long 40-plus yard run, I think he capped at like 20.40 miles per hour. So we're talking about a guy who's listed at 6'4", 6'5", 290, running faster than Isaiah Pacheco in the open field. He's one of the older prospects in the draft at 24 years old. People are going to want to call him raw, and I don't think that's fair. I think that he just plays with so much explosion and speed. It's just like he needs to be contained a little bit, needs to reel it in. Excellent motor, really high effort guy. He's gonna make you pay for it down after down after down. I really think that he's gonna be a guy who excels in the one-on-one drills in the Senior Bowl. I think people are going to be like, counting and trying to get him, change the line, make sure they don't have to match up with White. He's got really good length and uses it. It pops out on film. You can see how he locks guys out, extends, and will just rip out of blocks. Again, sometimes he just gets caught in the traffic of things. He gets he saw a lot of attention when he was at Georgia Tech because he was the guy on the team that you needed to worry about. Obviously, freaky athletic, didn't produce as much as you would want him to necessarily. I think that there's a question about what is his role. Never had a double-digit sack season or anything. 7.5 last year, not the worst performance in the world, but when you talk about top tier talents or whatever, doesn't pop off the field or off the screen. I think that this is a guy who is primed to be a really good NFL player if he gets a chance to get in the right situation. And I think Kansas City makes sense for him as a guy who can come in, who takes a little bit of time to learn, has some other, veterans in that locker room. You have a coaching staff who knows what they're doing, and a guy who can be deployed as a true weapon, as a true difference maker on the defensive front. The athletic profile to me just jumps off the screen, and you see it on his tape. It's hard to deny that. So Keion White, defensive end on Georgia Tech, tops my list as a guy who is somebody who I'll be watching very closely at the Senior Bowl. So just to run those down real quick, just their names. Number 10 was Chase Brown, running back out of Illinois. Number 9 was Wanya Morris, offensive tackle out of Oklahoma. Number 8 was wide receiver Rashee Rice out of SMU. Number 7, Daniel Scott, safety out of California. Number 6, Andre Carter II, defensive end out of Army. Number 5, Derick Hall, defensive end out of Auburn. Number 4, Matthew Bergeron, offensive tackle, Syracuse. Number 3, Sidney Brown, safety out of Illinois. Number 2, Darnell Wright, offensive tackle, Tennessee. And number 1, Keion White, defensive end, Georgia Tech. Those are my top 10 guys to watch for the Senior Bowl. Like I said, I'm recording this the night that the Chiefs have locked up a spot in the Super Bowl. And it's hard to talk about, all the draft stuff right now. Scout's excited in the background. I'm going to go hang out and watch some more clips of Travis Kelce talking trash to Cincinnati's mayor. But I wanted to make sure that you guys had the draft content that you are also eagerly waiting for. The draft is coming one way or another. And we're going to cover it. I'm going to harass Garrett and Kyle until they let me talk about it or let me do some more solo episodes. But as the Senior Bowl week starts up and the practices begin, keep an eye on these players. And we'll hopefully see some of them in red and gold next year. So, as always, thanks for listening. Appreciate you tuning in, letting me ramble at you guys for a little bit. And we will be back, continuing our regularly scheduled shows as we go through the rest of the season. Only one game left, and can't wait to talk to Kyle and Garrett about that here soon this week. So, again, thanks for listening. And as always, if you've got questions, hit me up on Twitter at ArrowheadTom. Always happy to talk draft with anybody who is interested. So, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.